relationships?
Well, I think it's best to talk about student-centeredness by originally contrasting it to professor-centered education, which I occasionally fantasize about doing, but it's so wrong. Which is just getting up basically and lecturing and assuming that there's sort of a transfer of information. I have information to transfer to students, and I will say it, you will write it down, you will regurgitate it back to me, and we will all be happy and go on our merry way. Student-centered education demands more of the professor in the sense that we have to ask ourselves what the students know and what their experience is, how they're going to use this material, in order to figure out how best to guide them through the path of learning what we want them to learn. And so in a classroom, that means that there's a lot more small group activity that's clearly directed. It's not like in high school where teachers put people in small groups and they just sort of talk about their hair. No, we actually demand they produce things in small groups, and we make sure that they are prepared on a given day. So it's much harder for students to hide in our classes than in classes where you're just being lectured at.
Yeah.
We expect students to step up, and they've got to be ready to. They have to have been prepared for the day and be ready to meet a real challenge. And so it also means meeting students on their turf. We scaffold things. We say, okay, what have you learned already that I can then build on for what I want you to know? It's not just saying, well, I expect you to learn this and I don't care where you started. We have to care where they started, because you can't just make somebody leap from point A to Z in 1 minute. You have to, take them through the whole alphabet. And so student-centered education asks where the students are and says, okay, as a teacher, how do I move there and then move the students forward to where I want them to be?
Material.
Well, I teach research methods, which is always a bit difficult because it's sort of like teaching a class where you're teaching people how to use tools, but not necessarily letting them build a house. And so what I've done in the research methods class when I've taught it often is make them do a survey, make them come up with questions, make them go out and do the survey and then analyze the data. And so that doing the survey piece actually sends people out in the street. They have to talk to people. They have to, construct it. They actually have to go through the process of doing this to actually learn what a survey is and what's good about them and what's bad about them, etc. But it's much more authentic than me just lecturing and having them read a book and answer questions
What are
on
the
what
10
is a survey.
points about building a survey?
Yes, exactly. No, you actually have to do it.
Yeah.
And that sort of reflects Pacific's, in general, Pacific's focus on experiential learning more generally. And so we want students to take what they learn in the classroom and make it practical, whether it is in internships or whether it's in study abroad, which I'm more related to, or just building things into our classes. I have a colleague who's a cultural anthropologist who has students do ethnographies in Stockton, California, which is this incredibly diverse city. It's a very dynamic city, and by studying Stockton, they learn a lot about cultural anthropology, and so we take advantage of the resources we have and give students real experience. We team teach across disciplines because SIS is an interdisciplinary school. And so I'm a political scientist. We have economists, we have anthropologists, we have political scientists, we have a historian. And the idea of team teaching is putting those people together who usually disagree on how to view the world and having them teach a class together. So there are times when we'll be standing in front of the students sort of arguing over how best to analyze something. But the goal is for our students to see the world in a more complex way than we do. So I see the world through the lens of a political scientist, and an anthropologist sees the world as an anthropologist. But we want our students to be able to see it from different avenues, because the problems in the world are more complex than just one lens. And so we want our students to be able to look at things from multiple sides and to understand issues more deeply. We require it. We're the only school in the country, I think, that requires, to get an international studies degree, we require you to actually leave the country for at least a semester. And our ultimate goal is for our students to achieve intercultural competence. We want people to be able to recognize cultural differences and adapt to them, and thus be able to work and study and play in international environments in a really productive way. We want them to be able to live in an environment with people who are not culturally the same as them, whether that is teaching in the school district in Stockton, California, which is a very diverse area, or actually living and working abroad. And so we train people for that. We train for that sort of intercultural diversity. And going abroad is an important part of that. And it's especially an important part, I think, for middle-class white students who have never been a minority before.
Yeah.
But you go abroad and suddenly you have to adapt. You're not part of
Yeah.
the dominant culture anymore. You have to adapt. And it makes people far more sensitive to what it means to actually have to live and change the way you think and function and understand how other people think and function and work in their lives. And what we're doing, in addition to making sure that they can write well when they walk out of there, is we make them take responsibility for their own learning and for organizing themselves. And so they have to organize study groups, they have to do all sorts of things. The sophomores who have survived it before end up organizing study groups for the freshmen. So there's this mentoring thing going on with the students. But it means that from the beginning, the skills they're taught in that class then spring out to the other avenues of their lives, and then they start organizing other things. And so they had to organize in these classes, so suddenly they're organizing social entrepreneurship groups, and they're organizing various sort of projects on campus, and they do it without batting an eyelash. It's amazing. So that ultimately our goal is they won't need us, because in 4 years they won't have us. But we still expect them to keep learning, and we still expect them to keep being able to focus and figure out what they need to do next.
Creating lifelong learners.
Exactly, exactly. And
in the classroom.
We end up knowing our students really well, partially because we're in this marvelous building that has a lounge downstairs and a kitchen. So students hang out here. And so we end up talking to our students a lot outside of class, and most of us have sort of semi-open door policies, so students pop into our offices all the time. And so we end up knowing our students inside and outside of class quite a lot. And so by the time and we have them in multiple classes across from their freshman year to their senior year. And I think this is fairly typical of all of Pacific. And so it means that we know what their strengths and weaknesses were as freshmen, and we know how they change and how they develop over the 4 years, and it's really cool. And it's